every retrospective project hits a wall where the rose-tinted glasses have to come off. When you commit to documenting the structural timeline of a legendary survival horror franchise, you enter a silent agreement with yourself that you don't just get to skip the chapters that make you cringe. You have to turn over every single stone in the library, even when you know for an absolute fact that what's crawling around underneath is going to test your patience as a fan. You have to look at the failures with the exact same focus you give the masterpieces. Which brings us inevitably to the one game I spent a decade actively avoiding. When Umbrella Corps dragged its way onto the digital storefronts in June 2016, I didn't buy it, I didn't rent it, and I didn't even bother to watch a full playthrough on YouTube. From the outside looking in, it didn't just look like a mediocre spin-off, it felt like the final definitive nail in the coffin for a franchise that had completely lost its mind. To me, the series was already on life support after the exhaustion of Resident Evil 6, and watching Capcom double down by releasing a budget, third-person tactical esports shooter felt like a total creative bankruptcy. It felt like the suits in the boardroom had completely taken the wheel. I never played it back then, and honestly, I never wanted to. The entire concept felt completely alien to why I fell in love with this universe in the first place. How do you go from the creeping, claustrophobic dread of a dark hallway in the Spencer Mansion to elite mercenaries sliding across concrete floors at 60 miles an hour while trading headshots in a competitive arena? The game didn't just lack horror, it seemed to despise the very idea of it. But the archive demands completeness. If we're going to do this properly, we don't get to leave the gaps in the timeline just because the entry is embarrassing. So, purely out of completionist obligation to leave no stone unturned before we head into the massive modern era, it is time to perform a quick, clinical autopsy of the absolute nadir of the franchise. Let's just get this over with. Welcome back to the archive. This is the retrospective journey where we document the entire history of survival horror, tracking its evolution from the pixelated foundations to the modern era. And today, we are charting the absolute lowest point the Resident Evil franchise has ever reached. Context is absolutely everything when you look back at June 2016. Behind closed doors, a massive, highly secretive corporate pivot was already well underway inside Capcom's headquarters. The developers were quietly cooking up a terrifying first-person reinvention that would completely save their reputation, but the public didn't quite know that yet. To the average fan standing in the middle of 2016, the outlook for the franchise wasn't just bleak, it looked completely terminal. To make matters worse, 2016 wasn't just a random release year, it was supposed to be a massive celebration. It marked the 20th anniversary of the entire Resident Evil series. Now, usually when a legendary franchise hits a major 2-decade milestone, a studio marks the occasion with a masterpiece. They put together a love letter to the fans who spent 20 years buying their games, supporting their characters and building their community. Instead, Capcom blew out the candles on their anniversary cake and handed the world Umbrella Corps. It was a budget-tier multiplayer spin-off slapped together on the Unity engine, built with the transparent clinical corporate goal of chasing a slice of the lucrative tactical esports shooter market, but instead of feeling like a fun, competitive side project to enjoy between mainline releases, it felt like Capcom was actively mocking their own history. They took iconic, sacred locations from the lore, the ruined atmospheric streets of Raccoon City, the classic villages of Resident Evil 4, and the sun-bleached marshlands of Kaijuju, and reduced them to generic, acid-flipped multiplayer arenas. It was an entry born completely without a soul, designed by a committee that seemed to understand modern gaming trends about as well as a zombie understands calculus. It wasn't the survival horror we wanted, and it wasn't even a competent action game, it was just a corporate exercise in chasing a trend that had completely passed them by. Trying to analyse Umbrella Corps like a traditional entry today is a completely surreal experience because the game is effectively a ghost town. The multiplayer matchmaking servers are totally dead, meaning the core competitive loop the entire package was explicitly built around doesn't even exist anymore. If you boot up your console or PC today, you are essentially left with The Experiment, a bare bones, brutally repetitive single player horde mode where you fight endless waves of brain-dead AI zombies in small looping environments. It is a lonely, hollow experience that somehow manages to feel even more depressing than the multiplayer must have felt back in 2016. But honestly, you don't need functioning servers or a full lobby of players to understand why this game carries such a profoundly toxic reputation. You just have to look at its absolute mechanical madness. The developers tried to solve the fundamental problem of putting slow, classic zombies into a fast-paced competitive shooter by introducing an incredible goofy mechanic called the Zombie Jammer. Every player wears a futuristic, glowing backpack that emits a frequency making the undead completely ignore you, essentially turning the biological terrors into moving pieces of environmental cover, that is, until an enemy player shoots at your backpack. The moment your jammer is damaged, the device breaks, causing every zombie on the map to instantly aggro and sprint towards you like they've just heard the dinner bell. It was a neat idea on paper that devolved into complete chaos in practice. Then there was the Brainer, a heated tactical ice axe melee weapon that completely shattered whatever fragile balance the game was trying to maintain. Because the gunplay felt incredibly clunky and the camera angle was pulled into a bizarre claustrophobic over the shoulder view that obscured half your screen, players quickly realised that guns were entirely useless. Why bother trying to aim a generic assault rifle when you could just exploit the movement physics? The entire meta of the game instantly devolved into elite mercenaries sliding around the floor at supersonic speeds, looking less like highly trained soldiers and more like broken Olympic speed skaters trying to whack each other in the skull with a glowing orange pickaxe. It didn't just look ridiculous, it physically rejected the basic tenets of competent shooter design. The physics were fundamentally broken, the animations were incredibly stiff, and the overall level of polish was completely non-existent. It didn't just have a bad reputation because the fans were angry about the lack of horror, it fully earned its status as a mechanical and commercial disaster. In a strange, twisted way, Umbrella Corps holds an incredibly important place in the history of this franchise. Every great story needs a rock bottom, every legendary redemption arc requires a moment of absolute, undeniable failure, so catastrophic that it forces the total structural collapse of the old way of doing things. Without this specific disaster, the studio might have kept limping along, trying to compromise and squeeze multiplayer elements into the mainline titles for years to come. This game was the necessary vacuum of creativity. It was the definitive, unarguable proof that the corporate directive to chase modern Western shooter trends had completely run out of gas and crashed into a brick wall. It proved to Capcom, once and for all, that if they kept trying to turn Resident Evil into something it wasn't, the franchise was going to die a quiet, embarrassing death. It was the darkest hour right before the dawn, the absolute lowest point the pendulum could swing before it had no choice but to rush back the other way, because just when it felt like the series was permanently buried in the dirt, Capcom did the unthinkable. They stopped looking at what other multiplayer shooters were doing, turned around, and looked all the way back at what made them legendary back in 1996. They stripped away the action, dropped the forced companion gimmicks, threw out the competitive esports ambitions, and prepared a massive, monumental franchise overhaul that would shock the entire industry. They realised that to save the future, they had to remember the past. But before we pack our bags and move to the deep, terrifying swamps of Louisiana for that grand reinvention, let's take care of the internet inventory management. If you enjoyed this quick, completionist trip down to the absolute depths of the archive, make sure to tap that like button to help the video survive the algorithm. Leave a comment below sharing your funniest moments of this 2016 train wreck, and hit the subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming transition into pure horror. A massive thank you goes out to the channel members. Your direct support ensures I keep turning over every single stone on this massive library, even the ones that smell like a rotten bioweapon. If you want early access to the upcoming scripts or want to support the project further, take a look at that join button below. Next time on the Retrospective, the action is over, the guns are empty, and we are stepping onto the porch of a derelict plantation house. Get ready, it's finally time for Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. This has been Parasine, thanks for watching.
Call to him and he will come. She'll run to him like he's the one. His arms that stretch, but when she's done, he'll be torn.